Okay, we are now live on YouTube. Okay, we are now live on YouTube. Okay, I can hear my.
Okay, Howard should be in the room now.
Spotlighting Howard. One second. I don't think it'll allow me to do more than 5 people for the spotlight. So once I'm finished, oh, you're muted, Ma'raj.
You should be able to go ahead and take me off the spotlight and you can go ahead and put Howard up.
Perfect. And then I'll add Howard. Welcome everyone joining. We're about to get started. Okay, one second. Okay, great. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, welcome everyone. At any time during this session, you need anything in terms of accessibility, in terms of interpretation, please feel free to ping the chat. We have Claudia from our accessibility team on here, and she can assist with any needs in terms of getting set up for today. However, first, I'm just going to make sure that we go over the text slides, just because in this new day and age that we're in, it's important that we're all on the same page as it relates to getting set up with all of this technology in order to view this wonderful presentation. So welcome again for those that are trickling in. My name is Ashia Aubourg, and I am newly on this Chicago Food Policy Action Council team as their data and operations specialist. So today I'll just be doing the intro and then I'll pass it over to our panelists. So welcome to the 16th Annual Food Justice Summit. Basically, these slides will just go over different things that we should be aware of when participating in these sessions. So as you all know, a lot of folks are familiar with Zoom. However, we are moving towards Whova this year. So really quickly, we just wanted to go over the quick differences. So although Zoom is integrated, Whova allows for a lot of communication. So throughout this session, if you decide you want to engage in the chat, feel free. There's a chat on the Whova platform, as well as a chat in the Zoom platform, and folks can feel free to engage in either. For attendees who choose to access the sessions via Zoom, they will do so by clicking the link in the session, which you guys probably have already done because you're here. And again, same way you can do that via the desktop app, or you can use your phone as well. Again, it's optional to show your video during this discussion, but when we do the Q&A portion, if you would like to, it's completely welcomed. And again, here are some screenshots and examples of different buttons that might be useful during this session. So for example, we have an arrow pointing to the chat. If you want to type in any comments or questions, feel free to throw that in there. As well as for accessibility purposes, there is a live transcript button at the bottom. So feel free to click that if you need those services.
Ashia, I don't believe we can see your slides if you are showing them.
Oh no. Okay, 1 second. Can you see now?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry about that. This whole time I thought the slides were showing, so my apologies. So I'll just repeat that really quickly. On this screen, you can see some screenshots of some of the various buttons that may be useful to you during the session. So we have the chat button. If anytime you want to add any comments, or if you want to ask any questions, feel free to throw it in there. And then for accessibility purposes, we also have this live transcript button that you can click to receive those services. Can you see this slide that I moved on to next?
Yes.
Okay, so for some Zoom etiquette, just to help with making sure that we can all communicate with each other properly, please rename yourself with your name that you prefer, as well as your desired pronouns. And you can basically rename yourself by hovering over the section of your name on your little tiled box, and then click on that, and then essentially just rename yourself whatever your preferences is. And again, I'm also learning with this, but we should try, especially for our speakers and folks that ask questions, to speak slowly so that our translators can communicate effectively without missing any important information. And then whenever you do decide to speak, please state your name every time you do, so that various folks using ASL will know who is speaking. And then I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but if interpretation is something that you would prefer, there is a button that you can click so that interpretation is enabled. Right now we have a Spanish interpreter on the line. And again, if anything comes up where for some reason this isn't working for you, please feel free to ping the chat, or you can directly ping Claudia. They have a team on their name, and they can essentially help you with anything accessibility related. And same thing with the live captions. There is a button at the bottom of your screen, and those will bring up any captions. Again, if anything comes up, we are here to help. Just please ping the chat. And then again, since you all are here, I assume that this was pretty accessible in terms of accessing the session. But for those who may be viewing us on YouTube and trying to get into the session, there are two ways that you can do it. Both ways will get you into this session. You can either do it through Zoom or through Whova. The only difference with Whova is that you'll be able to access the entire platform and some other related chats and things going on in that platform. Again, chats will be happening both in Zoom as well as in Whova. And our communications team, I think we have Nora on the chat, will also help in assisting with communications needs if you have any questions. And then, of course, when you enter, just be sure to connect to audio so that you can hear all of our speakers as well as interpreters. So if you're currently in the session right now and are not able to hear anything, you may need to re-exit and go back in and join by audio. And then again, just speaking about the differences between Whova and Zoom. Whova allows for a lot more engagement in terms of chatting and using polls and really connecting with community. So again, you can chat through this Zoom box on here, but also feel free to engage through the Whova platform. Again, any questions, please feel free to ping us in the chat about that. And then as it relates to engagement, we have community boards, and I've already seen that some folks have been engaging in these boards. At any time throughout this summit, you would like to engage in any of these, feel free. You can find this in the Whova platform under community. And then, of course, there will be some really fun prizes for folks that engage a lot throughout the event. Again, I mentioned earlier the A team, so that stands for our accessibility team. On this chat, we have Claudia representing the A team. If you have any questions or need any assistance, feel free to directly message her or message the chat broadly, and we can help with that. And that's it for me. Okay, and I'm going to unpin.
Ashia, I have a quick question. Would you be able to actually make Weslynne a co-host?
Of course.
I don't know if I can do that, just in case that there is.
Weslynne is a co-host now, and I'm going to unpin myself and put you back, Ma'raj.
Sounds good. All right, well, welcome everybody. I am super excited about this session. Today we have Weslynne Ashton, Saria Lofton, and Howard Rosing with us. And we're going to be basically getting a little tour of the work that they have been involved in with their respective mapping projects. Over the course of the last several months, especially over the past year with COVID, there's been a lot of different efforts to sort of map different aspects of the food system in our Chicago Foodshed. And as this mapping work is happening, we really wanted to hold space for some conversation with the researchers who have been really putting these efforts forth, and to learn more about the collaborations taking place, and also learn about their perspectives on this work and how they are engaging communities.
Really?
So with that, I'll start with Weslynne Ashton. Weslynne, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the work that you've been doing and what has been inspiring you to do this work.
Thanks, Ma'raj. So I'm Weslynne Ashton. I'm an associate professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology. I am appointed in the School of Business in the Institute of Design. And I'm a part of a group called the Midwest Consortium for Equity, Research, and Food Justice. And that is the platform that brought all of us on the screen together. So Saria and Howard were all members. And this is a community of researchers from across the city who work on different aspects of understanding the food system and really trying to advance sustainability and equity issues. So in my own background, I come mainly from an environmental sustainability space, so really trying to understand the impact of different industrial activities on our ecosystems and ways to redesign and reduce those impacts. And I would just like to share a little map, a conceptual map that our team put together to just show the connections between the work that we're doing in MServe, right? So our regional foodshed, which we are defining as the 300-mile radius around the city of Chicago. We bring in a lot of food, both from within this area, but also outside of it. And with SIFPAC, we have been very engaged in how the Good Food Purchasing Initiative and purchasing program can be used to shift changes in the food system towards greater sustainability and equity. So what we've laid out here are the policies, the research, and the actions that are taking place. So Howard Rosing from DePaul and I are spending a lot of our time in the lower right-hand corner of this map looking at producers. So we've been, and this is primarily Howard's team, has been mapping farms across this 300-mile radius, and that's been done in collaboration with other organizations, so like the Illinois Stewardship Alliance, the Center for Regional Food Systems at Michigan State University. And so we really want to get an understanding of what food is being produced for human consumption in this region. And so knowing where the farms are, what they're producing is one part of this work. The other part of it is really understanding the relationships. And so that's what we're calling the organizational mapping. So looking at how institutions in the city of Chicago, so things like Midwest Foods and Gourmet Gorilla, who are aggregating food from these local farmers and helping to distribute that within the cities. So we're looking at the organizational relationships, mapping the food value chain, and also exploring the feasibility for increasing that type of local aggregation, particularly in support of Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses from farmers, and also supporting the communities. I think Saria is going to talk a bit about her work, and she's looking a bit more on the consumer side and healthy food access. And so we just, have this really diverse group of researchers, right? So geographers, business, design, anthropologists who are looking at the food system in a very multifaceted way to try to understand what's going on and push the opportunities for really making change in the system towards greater sustainability. So much, I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing.
Before you stop sharing, Weslynne, I'm actually wondering, is it possible to zoom in on that graphic just a little bit more so that folks can take a closer look?
Yes, I mean, so up towards the top, we are looking at policies, and this is, I think, mainly a lot of the work that CIFPAC and allies, like the Chicago Lawyers Coalition, looking at issues affecting urban and peri-urban farmers, such as access to land and ownership, and how planning decisions affect the availability of those resources, water access, institutional purchasing. We know that access to capital and funding is an important challenge, and it's one that we've not quite tackled yet. And our work is mainly focused on this area, really understanding consumers and producers and how to link the work of the producers to meet the needs of people across the city and the region.
Thank you, Weslynne. I'm actually very curious as to, could you share more about how you go about gathering this information? How do you engage with producers to get this information? Because we know how important, based on who you speak to, the information is going to be different, the focus is going to be different. So how do you approach this information gathering in a way that is representative of our communities?
Yeah, so we have a number of different ways that we're trying to do this. So Howard's team from DePaul has been able to, using publicly available data, and the USDA agricultural census is one source, to actually find information about the location, the addresses. We've had our team of students looking through, trying to find the websites for these farms to find contact information for them. So that's one way, just using publicly available information. We work through our partner organizations, so like SIFPAC, I mentioned ISA. We also have the Urban Stewards Action Network in the city. And so we have both conversations with all of these groups to understand what are the needs. And just to give an example, last spring when COVID hit, ISA was doing a big outreach effort to the farmers in their network to understand how COVID was impacting them. And we had our graduate student researchers help in that effort and help in the outreach to understand what they were going through, positive or negative, and help to connect them to resources like the buy local resource directory that ISA is offering to farmers. We also have a survey that we're conducting. So with that list of 1,000 plus email addresses from farms across this 300-mile radius that we're able to build, we've been engaged in an email outreach survey to get the opinions. And we've been working with our partner organizations to make sure that we get the voices of those important stakeholders, those important farmers in the Chicago, Cook County area, across Illinois, the specialty farmers, so that we're really doing both blanket outreach as well as a more targeted outreach to different groups that we think are important.
Thank you, Weslynne. Yeah, this graphic I think is very helpful in just seeing the ways in which this work is compiling information from the various different aspects of the food system. Thank you so much for sharing that. Next, I want to introduce Howard Rosing. Howard, can you share a little bit about your work and the mapping efforts that you've been involved in and give us a little introduction?
Sounds good. Thank you, Ma'raj, and thanks, Weslynne, for that introduction to our work together. It's a pleasure to be here and speak to you about this work, and also hopefully make connections with people, because mapping is a very relational process. A lot of people think it's just sitting in a room and putting numbers in spreadsheets and digitizing various things. But in fact, it is a relational process. And so hoping that through this meeting, actually, we can advance our work by making connections with people. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I direct a center at DePaul University called the Steans Center, or Community Engagement Center for the university, working mainly with faculty and students on projects like this one, or like the ones that we're talking about today, working to support local food systems work, regional food systems work, food access work, food justice work, food sovereignty work, and so forth. I also teach and co-direct in a master's program called the Sustainable Urban Development that has a certificate program in sustainable urban food systems, and do research in this area. As a cultural anthropologist, my main work is around ethnographic work, which is really getting on the ground and working with people and understanding how what the food systems means to them, what kinds of ways that they are contributing to the food systems, the assets they bring to it, but also some of the barriers they're facing, and how, in particular, how research might be effective in supporting advocacy and supporting work to change systems. So some of the work that I've been recently involved in has to do with what Weslynne was referring to, which is really trying to figure out the landscape of producers who are producing food for humans, at least initially, and understanding where they are within this 300-mile radius of Chicago that involves sort of several states, obviously, and several different types of regions that are food producing and have diversity within them. And we often don't think of the diversity of especially the rural areas, but we have quite a bit of diversity, and we're trying to understand that diversity. As Weslynne Ashton mentioned, we are trying to understand the location of BIPOC producers in particular, how we can integrate questions around equity and access to supply chains that will be and are developing for Chicago as a result of the good food purchasing policy. But also something that's really important about that work is to understand all the features of the landscape of food that make food systems work, including places where food is processed, places where food is manufactured, where it's distributed, where it's stored, including storage that involves cold storage, which is something I'll mention here. And so in addition to the work that my students and I are working on to document where producers are, what they're doing, our plan is to get out in the next, hopefully the next 3 years, to be actually exploring many of these producers, working with them to understand the questions around access to supply chains for Chicago's food system. And especially eventually working to understand those BIPOC-owned farms that are particularly a focus of our work, as Weslynne mentioned, to understand how they can access, or if they're interested, access supply chains for Chicago. As part of that, I mentioned the importance of understanding the full landscape of the food system, the full resources that make the food system operate in a state that mostly imports food from other states, majority of our food. And so beyond the sort of understanding of the producers themselves, we are starting to dive into this question of important resources like cold storage. And I think there's a sense of urgency around cold storage for a number of reasons. We've heard about the need for cold storage around vaccines and so forth. But there's also an urgency that we've seen through our work with CIFPAC in working groups to understand what people on the ground who are working on emergency food rescue, food aid work in the city, in particular in Chicago, what kinds of resources they actually are looking for to make their work effective, to make sure that the food that they're accessing can reach people that really do need food and are facing critical issues, as we all know, around food access right now. So working alongside folks in CIFPAC, mutual aid groups that have joined our conversation. There's a session going on right now, I think, around with some of those mutual aid groups that really try to understand what is their questions around accessing resources. And what became particularly important in recent months is this question of cold storage. So we started a project maybe a little over a month or so ago to really begin to identify cold storage within Chicago, cold storage spaces within Chicago, but also cold storage spaces within the 300-mile radius of Chicago. As we know we're going to need that information to really begin to understand the full landscape for the good food purchasing policy. So I'll end by just saying, or end this segment by just saying that we have students from a variety of different backgrounds going into various databases, putting together as much information, contacting cold storage spaces, commercial cold storage spaces, contacting grocery stores to try to understand what cold storage they may have accessible, whether there are closed grocery stores that may have accessible cold storage, And they're also trying to understand those in proximity to mutual aid groups within the city of Chicago. And so I can get into more to the details of that, but that's essentially one of the other projects, in addition to my work with Weslynne on the producers that we are really interested in, especially during this time of the pandemic. So thanks, Ma'raj.
Thank you, Howard. And I want to make sure that we have enough time for Saria Lofton to be introduced. I know, Saria, you need to take off a little bit earlier than the rest of the panel. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and the work that you've been doing.
Great. Hello, my name is Saria Lofton, and I want to thank Ma'raj for inviting me to speak on this topic. I am an assistant professor at the College of Nursing at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I've been interested in understanding the role of neighborhood environments on accessing healthy foods really since I've been a school nurse in Chicago Public Schools, and I was looking at the role of environment and food choices that the students I work with, the food choices that they would make, and seeing the role that it has in a lot of our behaviors. And in many of the neighborhoods that I worked in, fast food restaurants were abundant and fresh produce was sparse. So, and even if you did see it at a local store, it wasn't as appealing. So this is the foundation that led to really looking at the food environment, especially from the community resident point of view, when with this background around food choice. So I started looking at these maps probably around 2016. I'm going to show you my first map, so don't judge me too harsh, but it's going to kind of give some context into what led to this point with mapping. Let me see here. Okay, so this was my first map in Austin community, where I grew up in for a GIS class, and I was appalled at the lack of retail that existed to access healthy foods. But then when I added in let's see, and this was just only with grocery stores, but when I added in food pantries and community gardens, it looked very different. And it thought about, what if we added in like mobile markets, farms, other alternative access points for fresh produce? And I imagined that this map would get a lot fuller because I ran into so many people that managed community gardens in Austin. And I realized that original map didn't really provide context, only a small picture what food access really is in Austin. But even with that, how did community members see it? Did they know what was accessible to them in their communities? And that's what led to this current project eventually over a couple of projects led to here, and where we were developing a project to better understand communities' perceptions about accessing food and about where, and even though I know about where to access food, and the people I work with know this is what we do. And what about people who just going to work, coming home, just trying to live their lives, are not necessarily going to get plugged into this network? So community food mapping can be powerful in supporting decisions about food choice and also building relationships with the local providers that are in our communities. So this is why it was important for me to kind of look at from that perspective. And then also in using a community-based participatory research framework, I work with a couple of other community organizations and individuals to look at how we can look at different levels of access and map it, and particularly in this. And because often we're looking at the deficits. Well, this doesn't exist, but what does exist? Just like the Austin map, if I just from the quote unquote food desert, it looked very sparse. But when we look at the other assets and resources that aren't usually highlighted, we see we probably have more than what we realize. So in mapping that, we'll also be looking at the physical infrastructure that exists in the formal, informal, and semi-formal network. And lastly, we'll be looking at this through this lens of food sovereignty, and then you'll see where it all comes together. Let me see here. There we go. So this is, I don't know how to make it bigger, but basically we have like a food sovereignty lens, which I borrowed from Canada's framework. And then our food system and food access is kind of small, but it looks like these 5 dimensions of food access and how that leads into food consumption. And then my final point of which is how all of this will lead to increased fruit and vegetable consumption and reducing chronic disease, especially in communities, in our predominantly Black communities where we're like burdened with chronic disease risk factors and chronic disease overall. And also, in addition to giving that insight, it will also provide opportunity for community members to know where they can obtain healthy food outside of what they would typically see. And so there's a lot of different ways that we are able to take this and make it, a really great project that works really well with the work that Howard and Weslynne are already doing and support our community food system in a very holistic way. And I think that's it.
So Saria, there's a question actually in the chat that I think weaves so beautifully into the process that you're describing of mapping, especially from the community perspective and the benefit of that work. So the question is, how do you navigate the space between higher level mapping and the day-to-day experiences on the ground and the rich knowledge that those experiences within the community offer?
That's a great question, because part of what we were looking to do was to start with just the perceived food access space. So we're not yet at the day-to-day experiences, which is where we want to get to, but by first speaking with community members, and we'll be focus groups and things of that nature to be able to look at, for them to tell us what those experiences are from a higher level and layer that onto an objective map. So we were able to map perceived food access over these objective measures that we've defined.
Thank you.
And
go ahead.
I was reading it at the same time, so I saw that if mapping Austin or others. Yes, that was my JS class project, but we're mapping in West Garfield Park in Inglewood right now.
And this is such an important point. I think this is something that I would love for Howard and for Weslynne, for both of you to weigh in on as well, which is how do we capture the wisdom of community and the information that isn't formalized, but that is very much alive and existing within the community. Weslynne, I see you shaking your head, so I'm going to let you take it first before Howard. Go for it.
Sure. We're just writing a proposal about this. And I guess here would look to work that's being done by the folks who are trying to build the food resource navigator. And I think also the work that CIFPAC is also doing, right? And so we need to create platforms, where we can have ongoing slow conversations, right? So I think that as researchers, there's a tendency to do a study, do it quickly, get the results, try to get it published. And recognizing that to have impactful work in communities and with communities, that we need to really be more deliberate and intentional in building relationships and really understanding what the needs and opportunities are across various stakeholder groups, right? So we've been focusing a lot on the supply side, Saria's work on the consumer side. And so I think it's something that really takes time to build, but that we need deliberate platforms and spaces to enable those conversations that then folks like us can weave into the research proposals that we do, and really make the work be something that's useful, right? I think, like often where we start our research questions, it might not be embedded in what the community need or various people in a community need. And so that's a place that I think we are focused a bit more on, right? So thinking about, okay, what does the community need first? And then how can we build our research in support of those needs?
Yeah, and it looks like we have a couple of follow-up sessions that might also add to the context around this work. There's a session coming up with the Food Resource Navigator on Saturday. And we also have a session on story mapping, which is a very cool use of mapping technologies that allows for community members to actually paint a story, to share images, to share videos in a locationally based manner where you can actually go to a map and see this story sort of come together of what is happening on the ground. And so there will be a session on that as well, which if you have more of an interest in how community voice really can translate to mapping efforts like these, that is a really great session. Howard, I'm wondering if you have anything more to add. You bring the ethnography perspective. Can you speak more to the ways in which participatory research can happen and how communities can be engaged as part of mapping?
Sure. I'm actually a huge advocate for supporting participatory mapping. And many of the projects we've worked on over the years have been communities that are mapping their own assets. And maybe we're just using some tools from the university to help them digitize those maps or whatever it may be. Now it's becoming easier and easier to do it yourself without depending on institutional support from higher ed. So how can we make sure people have those resources? I think, as I said earlier, mapping is a relational process. So whenever we from higher education are mapping, in my view, I feel not only should we be sharing the products of our work, but we should be making sure that the products of our work reflect what people want to see mapped and that they want to be mapped. That's an ethical question. And to be able to use mapping for advocacy around policymaking, around injustice, wherever it is, and so forth. So I feel there are ways that we are trying to do that in our current work. We're trying to make sure that all our partners that we work with can have access to any maps that we're creating as part of our work with the Good Food Purchasing Policy evaluation. Obviously, the work on cold storage is in partnership, really in consultation, perhaps with mutual aid organizations who are looking to understand where they can access cold storage. I will also just mention a couple of other quick things. About 5 years ago, we published, Ben Helpend and I, and a number of other researchers, published the first map of community gardens across the city of Chicago. And that map was very telling because in respect to Saria's comments, what we began to see in mapping community gardens is that they were huge assets in both low-income communities and communities of color. And I'm happy to share that for a second, if you'd like. I pulled it up as Saria was talking and thinking about the assets. And so this screen sharing is not disabled, but if you'd like, it says disabled, but if you'd like to let me do that, I can share that with folks for commentary and discussion as just sort of an understanding of how Chicago in particular has so many food assets that are not necessarily visualized without actually beginning to map them.
And we can definitely get that share screen going. One moment. Ashia, would you be able to make Howard a co-host, please?
Yep, 1 second.
Thank you. And while we're doing that, I know we don't have much time left with you, Saria. So I just want to open up the space for you to kind of talk about some of these connections, since you are very directly working on how mapping can really reflect what is happening at the community level.
I think for the most part, I think we're just like at the, it seems like we're in the middle because we have so many maps, but I still think we're at the very beginning of a lot of this stuff and what we're doing and building those connections. I think, you know, there's unlimited potential. So I look forward to how all this comes together. Like I knew about this map that Howard is sharing, but I didn't even, I think it's the first time I've seen it. So how that could even connect, you know, so I'm going to let him tell more about what he's doing.
And thank you so much. In case we don't get back to you, Saria, thank you so much for joining us. Howard, please take it away.
Yeah, so this is already data that needs to be updated because it's 5-some years old now. And there are more community gardens in Chicago than even then. But what you can see here is sort of a visualization of how community gardens are in predominantly communities of color in Chicago, when you see the major clusters on the south and west sides. And those are also very much aligned with what earlier in the century people were referring to as food deserts, what many of us now refer to as food apartheid or supermarket redlining or other kinds of words, right? Because they don't, that word food or that concept of food desert doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually happening in communities, as Saria pointed out. So I can show you another map if we had more time, or if you'd like me to, that looks at the income, and it's obviously very much aligned with the same level. And what I think it's important to realize, I think, in sort of thinking about these types of maps, is that it gives people back the respect that they deserve and the advocacy tools perhaps that they need to argue that there needs to be more resources put forth to ensure that community food systems are invested in cities, because these are public health resources. These are community well-being resources. These are nutritional assets. These are really ways that people come together to work communally and build cohesion in communities that people are not necessarily recognizing all the time.
Thank you so much, Howard. I am noticing also that Nora has asked a very important question in the chat, which I'd love to get to. And I also really quickly, I'm seeing you shake your head, Saria. Would you like to jump in before we dive into that question, or if you'd like to speak to that question?
Yes, this is actually because we've had some discussions about community kitchens, like I would say a few months ago, and how that can be incorporated into the overall vision around urban agriculture, community food. And that's why this really struck me when Nora talked about about looking at community kitchens or other sell-in spaces, because I think that's where, you know, we're trying to get at in terms of those informal, semi-formal networks that we really want to support and encourage, and see how that can be visualized in a way that they can take that and run with it, or anyone can, and know about it.
Saria, one more thing. When you say informal versus formal networks, can you just tell us what are you talking about there?
Great question. I think because I actually got this from South Africa, because there was an article, they were talking about informal networks during COVID and how people were able to obtain food. And I was thinking a bit more of like typically the formal way that we get food, going to the grocery store, that's one aspect of it. Yes, is that the main way? But it's one. I mean, there's also, like, we have the community gardens that, how are mapped. We have so many, like, farms, these aquaponic farms. Like, there's one off of Van Buren in California. There was one, and they have like fresh produce. It's just these alternative spaces that we don't typically consider as part of our purview of access, that I would say is more informal, if that makes sense, or semi-formal.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's been pointed out sort of repeatedly as part of our working group call sessions that mutual aid this is an ancient form of human relationship. And so neighbors helping neighbors is very much a very real way in which people access and obtain food. I know, Weslynne, that you can really dig into Nora's question, which was, is there potential for these mapping projects to be used to build collective cooperative spaces, thinking especially about community kitchens, selling spaces outside of farmers markets?
So building on Saria's comment about leveraging formal and informal networks, I think there are many organizations across the city. So you mentioned the mutual aid group. We have cooperatives as and worker-owned cooperatives in particular as a business model that is really getting a lot of attention for its ability to increase the livelihood and the wealth in communities of color. And so I do see those as really viable spaces. And I'm thinking here of, Mike Strode and the Cola-Nut Collaborative, and thinking of the concept of time banking, right? So we are so conditioned to value everything in terms of dollars, in our society. And I think that what we're speaking about here is different means of evaluation. So looking at time, at resources, at relationships as forms of capital that we can use to get value. And so that's something that I'm looking at in my work. But to answer this question in another way is that we've been exploring the feasibility of food hubs. And so my graduate assistant, Jay Qureshi, will be speaking next Friday at another session that's looking at the GFPP and ways of bringing in different types of suppliers to support institutional purchasing. But one of the things that we've found with food hubs is that their definition is very nebulous, right? And so you can have a food hub that is a grocery store. You can have a food hub that's a space for collecting, aggregating, distributing, and kind of the main distinction about what is a food hub is really in its function. And its function is really trying to connect local suppliers, farmers, treating them fairly and connecting them to local buyers. And so how that takes place, there are a variety of business models. And so we're exploring different food hub business models across the city. So, another project that we have right now is in collaboration with a group of students from Illinois Tech with Chicago State University, where we've picked a couple neighborhoods across the city. So a group is looking kind of in the neighborhood of Chicago State. We have one that's looking in the neighborhood of Bronzeville, near to Illinois Tech, Austin, and Englewood. And we're seeing, okay, what are the resources here? What's the market? What are the opportunities? And so taking this information to explore business models that can create wealth and keep that wealth in the communities. And so I think a number of different models, so community kitchens, more market spaces, aggregation spaces are possible. And so this work is meant to just explore that and share that, right, with organizations that are in these spaces and also more broadly. I think it's our hope that the MSERF, the Midwest Consortium for Equity Research and Food Justice, is an open platform, and we welcome folks to join and participate in our monthly meetings, on our listserv, so they can learn about the type of research that is being done by at this point, it's probably like 2,000 or so researchers in this group, and growing nearly every day. But to think about how the research that these folks are doing might be in support of different communities' needs. And I think we just really want to ensure that our research is serving the needs of folks in the Chicagoland region.
Thank you, Weslynne. And as you mentioned, MSERF, or the Midwest Consortium for Equity Research and Food Justice, is a open group. It is a consortium of anybody interested in these research questions, and specifically researchers who want to actually help engage in this work to make the food system more transparent and pivot it towards food sovereignty, towards food justice. And so I did just post a link for that in the chat window. If there is anybody who is interested in joining that listserv, you can get notified of the monthly meetings for MSERF, for that coalition of researchers. Let's see. And I do want to encourage folks, please add your questions into the chat. We've gotten some really fantastic questions so far. One thing that's been brought up is how quickly data becomes outdated. And I think this kind of goes back to what we've been highlighting with the need for, how do we make these information systems community-based so that community wisdom is advising this work in an ongoing manner. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, and how do you go about that? How do you get communities to be engaged in this work? And also, how do you address the concerns, the very valid concerns that communities might have around that information being used in a way that isn't according to their best interest? Howard, would you like to take a hack at that first?
Sure. Let me just first start by saying that we in higher ed need to acknowledge that anytime something is mapped that has personal information or somebody's information on it, that it should not be, even if it's acquired through public resources, it should not be made public through a map without that person's acknowledgement and acceptance and support. And so that's, I think, a strict ethical question. Now, putting dots on a map without that information is not really doing that, like what you see in the community garden map that I showed you. But the Quamp map that you posted is a user input map for growers in Chicago that we created through a collaboration of 5 different organizations, including SIFPAC, and the Chicago Urban Agriculture Mapping Project. So that's a user input way. So that's how users, growers, that is, can be involved. I would say that participatory mapping is a very local, community-based, neighborhood-based, in cities at least, process. And that we in higher ed can be supportive of that, as I mentioned earlier. And there's sort of those deep ethical questions then about who owns the data. And that also needs to be worked out and respected and so forth. In terms of encouraging, to that really important point, I think encouraging is about that relationship, right? Building relationships with community groups who might benefit from a mapping process, bringing the tools that we can to that. None of us actually on this panel are actually geographers, I might mention. So mapping is not just for geographers. We do work with geographers like Danny Block at Chicago State and others, but none of us are geographers. And yet we're using mapping tools, we're using mapping processes because we see how important it is to have spatial understanding of things. And we know that community groups, when they know their assets, when they see their assets, when they connect their assets, they're more powerful. And so I've seen it happen over and over again. And so there's this questions around ethics, there's a question around participation, there's a question around knowing what higher ed has available in terms of resources, students that can assist, and so forth in projects that, you know, I would say it's a call out to the 74 or so people on this message. If you have mapping projects that are on the food system, we have students who would be interested in helping you do that. So I'm happy to put my email in and connect with you on that, because we want to encourage people to understand their food resources, their food systems, or whatever other kinds of issues they're concerned about. So that's how I would frame it, but it is really, really important that mapping remains a relational process when it's done in a way that's focused on community development and community advocacy work.
And I there was a question in the chat around the impact that food pantries have on communities, and I just want to highlight another mapping project that we've participated in, that CIFPAC has been engaged with, and that's the Food Access Hub map, which I just posted in the chat window, which shows basically where communities can access food from all sorts of different food access points, including food pantries. I do want to ask, and Weslynne, I don't know if this is something that you can contribute your thoughts to more, as far as using proprietary technologies for mapping. You know, there are some legitimate community concerns. How do you as a researcher sort of, you know, balance the tools and the technologies that you're using with those community concerns?
So I'd say I don't specifically use geographic mapping technologies, but there's certainly private databases that we have access to. So for example, in doing our food hub analysis work, we looked at some private marketing databases that we have access through the university, where we're able to get sales figures for different companies, right? And so that's not something that is publicly available, but we're able to use it to do an analysis of how profitable different types of food hubs are. And so in presenting the results of that work, what we try to do is to aggregate the information so that what we're seeing is, okay, food hubs of this type on average make $500,000 per year, or food hubs of this type on average make $100,000 per year. And so I think that, you know, it is an important ethical question that we have to deal with, because there's lots of information that organizations, whether it's community groups or private businesses, don't want out on the street. And I think that it's an important ethical consideration for us as researchers to really balance what data is needed for research purposes versus what's needed for public consumption, right? And I think that, you know, like in general, we feel that more transparency is better, but we still need to respect the privacy of organizations and individuals.
And I would just add that the best maps are when those individuals are involved in either driving the mapping process in communities or participating in a collaborative way, at least with us. So those like neighborhood mapping projects that we've done in the past are really important, working with local organizations, working with people who understand their neighborhoods really well, understand the landscapes really well, and are driving the process in some ways. Those are the most effective and perhaps the most ethical forms of mapping that exist.
There's been some questions around, how do we bring these mapping efforts together? And there is going to be a session on a project called the Food Resource Navigator. That is a session that will be taking place on Saturday, March 6th from 10:30 a.m. to noon. And that is actually one of the primary goals of that work is how do we compile all of these amazing resources? How do we center the narrative around those resources in a way that is focused explicitly on equity and justice, and that is made available and for use by the communities who are contributing, to our food system, who are actually making up our food system, and who are also contributing to the creation of these resources in most instances, because this work really can't happen without community input and communities contributing the wealth of knowledge that they hold. So that's something that we've also posted in the chat about that upcoming session. As we're kind of thinking through about how to bring this work together, I'm wondering, how has this past year, how has COVID-19, how have all of the changes that have come with that impacted the ways in which you're engaging with your work, Weslynne and Howard? How has it impacted your collaborations? Can you speak to sort of the ways in which that has changed?
I can start, Howard.
Go ahead, Weslynne.
So instead of seeing Howard once a month, I see him every other day. So I think, on one hand, there's the Zoom overload and everything is online. And we just have to deal with a lot of technology overload. But on the positive side, I think it has enabled more connection with our research team and kind of the wider group of folks that we engage with, and so it's probably like 4 or 5 meetings a week that we have in different buckets of research. I think one of the challenging things has been thinking about doing in-person interviews and even surveys, that everything is online, and so the survey that we are currently conducting with farmers in the 300-mile radius was delayed significantly. One, because we felt that we wanted to respect the time of the farmers that we wanted to reach out to, and not be in the growing season when they were really hard pressed because of COVID to adapt their businesses and really be very agile in what they're doing and how they're responding to the changes that were happening so frequently. But then it meant, kind of like getting all of the different avenues for sending out the survey through our partners. And so I feel like it's been a real mixed bag. And in some ways just very effective, more connectivity with folks that we're working with, but also harder.
Yeah, so I would just add to everything that Weslynne said is exactly what's going on with us. And I think what has really changed the dynamic of working on food systems research in Chicago in collaboration with community groups and others is that there's emerged this need for information and data that also exists within the context of what's happening during the pandemic in terms of food access and other things. And so it's really turned into two parallel kinds of research agendas that incorporate mapping, which one, the existing one that Weslynne and I have been working on for a number of years now in terms of the good food purchasing policy evaluation, and another sort of aligned with it and sometimes related to it, like cold storage mapping, that is really pertinent to what people need to know now on the ground. And so having worked initially last year in surveying people who are affected, or businesses and nonprofits, in actually in collaboration with you, Ma'raj, to understand the impact of the pandemic on small food businesses and nonprofits, looking at some of that data, trying to glean from it how we can, create more resources for PPE in the food sector, now cold storage. These things are sort of emerging on target for the pandemic issues that are also emerging out of conversations with people who are working on the ground on food systems issues. And so, I'll share one other mapping project related to earlier discussions. I mean, we've started the cold storage mapping project, right? And this is just a really raw data start with where we're starting to fill in the Midwest of where cold storage is, with an emphasis on Chicago. And this will get more complicated and more intricate and more detailed as we go along. But the idea is that we'll be able to understand data points for each of the cold storage spaces. And this will, in the end, as it relates to the pandemic, I'm trying to stop sharing. This will allow us to be hopefully more prepared regionally in terms of our resilience for future crises, for ongoing crises in the food system, right? That in the long term, I think the pandemic is going to make us realize that knowledge and information about how our food system operates is critical, not only for addressing critical issues around equity, but the resilience in the food system for all of us.
Ma'raj, can I add one caveat about being in this online environment is that it privileges those who have the technology and are comfortable using the technology. And so I think it that we have to figure out, how to reach folks who are not comfortable in this space. And so I think that through groups like the mutual aid, and I think even that we can have call-in functions on Zoom, but I have this worry that right, that we're only hearing the voices of those who are comfortable and connected, and that perhaps we need to do a better job of reaching out to those who are not.
Yeah, that really echoes my concerns as well, Weslynne, especially seeing the speed at which the technical aspects of this work have been able to come together. You mentioned that you and Howard used to see each other not nearly as frequently as every day, but now it's sort of, we're in these meetings on close to a daily basis or a pretty regular basis. And so one tension I know that, that we have felt as conveners is how do we make sure that the pace of this work does not go beyond the integrity of this work, the value of this work to communities, because that's really why we're doing this. So really ensuring that, you know, the spaces that we're holding, we are centering our values, we are slowing down, because it is so easy to speed up in this virtual reality for those of us who do have the privilege of being able to work from home and, you know, sit at home and do this, versus communities on the ground and like the many issues that that folks are dealing with. I did post a questionnaire. There's a little Qualtrics link, and I'm posting it one more time. And basically, this is just so that we can hear from our audience today. We would love to hear from you. Please share with us who you are, the communities that you belong to, how you feel about these mapping efforts, and how you would like to engage in some of this work. So if you are here and you're interested in just sharing more, you can go ahead and click on that link and tell us more about yourself, and how you can stay tuned. We have 15 more minutes, so I want to make sure that we get to questions. Let's see. There is a question: are there more ways for hospitals and primary care organizations to leverage the food access map? I can see this helping with referrals for patients and connecting them to community resources. That is a really great question, Sydney. And I know that, so Howard, Weslynne, I don't know if you want to speak at all to sort of the partnerships and the ways in which, you know, these mapping efforts are enfolding partners in health, in city government. Howard, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I am. We are working in collaboration with both the Chicago Department of Public Health and the Cook County Department of Public Health. They're at the table in terms of our evaluation work with the good food purchasing policy, and sort of driving a lot of the questions that we are also engaged in. Weslynne, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but we are really interested in these questions of health and how the good food purchasing policy impacts health, can be implemented by health institutions, including hospitals. I think that's something that the CIPAC has been working on as well, and how we can sort of map that impact or research and study that impact in general over the long term will be part of our evaluation project, I would say, in broad scope. Weslynne and I are mostly focused on producers and hubs and things like that right now, but there's a whole evaluation team that's looking at the broad-based impact of the good food purchasing policy, both at the city and county level. Go ahead, Weslynne, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to drop in the chat related to this question that, you know, we do have some of the researchers in our network. So Lena Hatchett at Loyola University works with the Proviso partners in the suburb of Maywood, and they have a whole VeggieRx program. And so I think that Andrea, you mentioned the hospital in Kansas City. So very similarly, the idea is that the physicians, nurses can prescribe vegetables, and they are orchestrating a food hub. So actually having a source of food there, or being a place for bringing food in that can fill these veggie prescriptions. So it's not just drugs, but actually food for health.
And I believe we had a session, or we are about to have I should look this up really quick when the session is on food as medicine. We have a food as medicine session that actually also discusses the VeggieRx program. And I apologize, I don't have that up on my agenda, but there is definitely a session during the summit on that.
Yeah, Nora just posted it. It's 10:30 tomorrow.
10:30 tomorrow. Awesome. Yeah, one thing that I just want to say is that, it's been such a one positive that has really come out of this virtual environment is that for myself personally, I've had the opportunity to really get to know Weslynne, Howard, other researchers who we've been engaged with, and my sense is that the level of relationship building that has been happening with the researchers that we work with the institutions that we work with, there's just a much more human element to all of this, and that the space to really inform our work through our values and to really examine our values in context of what is going on has been hugely valuable in sort of creating a landscape that is really priming this work to be more community focused and centering more on food sovereignty, food justice. I'm curious to know, what your experiences with that have been. If you can speak to, the ways in which this has sort of impacted you personally and your perspective on how you do your work.
You got a question for me?
Yeah, Howard, why don't you kick us
Sorry,
off?
I was finishing my chat comment. Sorry, can you repeat the question, please? Sorry.
So basically, we've had all of this time to really kind of get to know each other since we see each other now on a much more regular basis than, even though these were collaborations that were present before. I think the level of collaboration has really deepened with researchers, with institutional partners, even where before, there were much more of these structural sort of barriers, and we were much more kind of embedded within these cultural contexts that amplify almost the systemic barriers. And so now that folks are working from home and there's this, I don't know, I feel like this veil has kind of been broken, or pierced to some extent. I want to get your take. I want to get yours and Weslynne's take on this. Like, how are you perceiving this shift? How, is it a shift that you're perceiving, and how is it shaping your work?
Wow, Weslynne, do you want to start with that? It's a big question, because there is a veil been lifted in many ways. Not only because of the pandemic, but because of the social uprising that has existed over the last year. I don't know, Weslynne, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that we have certainly been able to connect more, but I feel like there also has to be intentionality in the connections, right? Because I have lots of meetings that still feel very structured and transactional, and for the folks who are working in the space of food justice in Chicago, just to tap on Howard's point about the protests last summer, calls for greater racial equity and social justice, that in the spaces where we intentionally took the space to talk about that and process that, that those are the spaces where there has been a shift of relationships, right? And I think in many of the other spaces that I occupy, it's like, okay, it happened, somebody wrote a letter, but there was not a deep engagement, and really a very authentic engagement. And so in those spaces, I feel like the connectivity has kind of stayed the same. But in those places where we were intentional about seeing the whole person, and being in community. And I think that's the difference between being a part of a community as opposed to, a job or something else. And I think that this work is, to Howard's point, like we're talking about mapping, but mapping is about showing the relationships. And so in a way, this period has really been about building the relationships that we need to burn this, to burn down and build up the food sovereignty system that we think we need.
Yeah, and I would just add to that also that since we are centrally focused on equity in our work, that at base value over the last year, we've had to recognize that most of the people that we're concerned about who are facing inequity are not on these screens, on midday during the week. Either they're not interested in being on these screens, or they don't understand what's going on because they're essential workers or whatever. So how do we tap into building relationships from this privileged standpoint, right? Positionality with people who are in, especially in our case, working in the food system, engaged in the food system, and don't necessarily connect with academics, right? So I've been really interested, for example, through my teaching and other ways, to connect with the folks who are working on various advocacy campaigns, like Restaurant Opportunities Center folks who are working with food workers in the food sector, and especially restaurant workers, and doing campaign work with students to support them. And how do we work with our networks, with our relationships, to engage with folks who are engaging with the people who are not on these screens? And that's kind of one of the challenges that pandemic has sort of shown us, that there's this veil of privilege, more so even now apparent, between academics and the folks we're interested in supporting.
Thank you for that. And on that note, wanting folks to engage to the extent that they would like to, making sure that those opportunities are made available frequently and at every step of the process. I want to really encourage folks before they leave this session to click into the Qualtrics survey that I've posted a link for in the chat window. We would love to hear from you, love to hear about your interest in any of the projects that were mentioned today, or any concerns. So with that, I want to thank Weslynne. I want to thank Saria Lofton, who did have to leave us a little bit early. And Howard, thank you so much for joining us today, and to our participants for all of the great questions.